iGlobenews brings global views.
Welcome to iGlobenews, the weekly video podcast where we discuss world politics and current events. My name is Diana Mautner-Markov, editor-in-chief of iGlobenews.org, and today I will be discussing with world-renowned China expert Professor Susanne Weigel-Schwierzig the topic, China's Asian leadership policy versus U.S. diplomacy of destruction. And for the record, today is May 9th, 2026. U.S. foreign policy under President Trump is frequently called the Don Roe Doctrine, a globalization of the Monroe Doctrine. Trump has adopted a big stick approach by leveraging intense military, economic, and diplomatic pressure, such as blockades, sanctions, and strategic airstrikes, to enforce U.S. interests, specifically targeting China's influence and aggressively aiming to neutralize Iran's military and nuclear capabilities. This Macht ist Recht approach is also Bibi Netanyahu's policy. China is following the policy of previous U.S. administrations, which can be characterized by a famous proverb popularized by the 26th U.S. President, Theodore Roosevelt, at the beginning of the 20th century, and I quote, "Speak softly and carry a big stick. You will go far." End of quote. In essence, this phrase means negotiate peacefully and diplomatically while maintaining a strong, credible threat of power to back up your position. This policy advises against bragging or making idle threats, suggesting that actions should speak louder than words. Clearly not President Trump's style. Iran's Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi met with his Chinese counterpart Wang Yi on May 6th in Beijing to discuss regional stability and bilateral ties. The Strait of Hormuz is still blocked, and Araghchi sought Beijing's support ahead of President Trump's planned visit to Beijing on 14th and 15th of May. So my question is, what do you think will be Beijing's top priority, stopping the war in Iran or improving economic relations with the U.S.? How can China help the U.S. get out of this war, which is also hurting China's economy?
Well, from my point of view, the reason why China is so interested in having President Trump as a visitor in Beijing next week is neither the situation in Iran nor the economic situation. It is Taiwan. Taiwan is what the Chinese government says time and again, a core issue for China. And China actually pursues a foreign policy that is openly focused on Chinese interests. They always say what their core interest is, what their main aim is, and what they want to achieve. And in this case, they were they have been so interested in sort of using this anticipated visit of Donald Trump in China in several ways, but mostly for the Taiwan issue. And the Taiwan issue actually is a hot issue at this moment. Most people don't really see this as a hot issue because they look at Iran, they look at Israel, they look at Ukraine, they look all over the world, but they do not necessarily look at Taiwan at this moment. But the Taiwan government is spending a lot of money on buying new weapons, and the only place where it can buy new weapons is actually the U.S. because they have had an agreement since 1982 that with the U.S. Having diplomatic relationships with the People's Republic of China, they continue to support Taiwan so that the People's Republic of China cannot sort of take over Taiwan by military means. So this has been an agreement between Taiwan and the U.S. since 1982, 3 years after establishing diplomatic relations between the U.S. and the People's Republic of China. And now the Taiwanese government has realized by observing the situation in Ukraine that a country like Ukraine, which to a certain extent you can compare to Taiwan or Taiwan to Ukraine, is in a position where it is extremely difficult in its asymmetric military relationship to this big invader. It is extremely difficult to actually to defend your territory. But you can make life really, really difficult for the invader if you use long-range missiles and attack certain objects in the invader's territory or on the invader's territory. And this, I think, is really, really interesting. So if they buy long-range offensive weapons, and this is what I think they are trying to convince the US, that the US should actually give these weapons to them. In this case, they can hit regions in the People's Republic of China, which are not only the most industrialized, the wealthiest, but also regions with a population that is as dense as it can be. So this would imply that if they start hitting these regions, they will sort of not only hit industrial complexes, but also civilians. And this is something that the Communist Party of China is extremely afraid of. Of course, they sort of try to tell their population that the Communist Party of China and its army is able to defend them, and they are safe and sure, in China, no problem for anyone. But if Taiwan has these kind of offensive weapons, then the situation becomes really, really difficult for the People's Republic of China. And that is why they said to Trump during the preparations for his upcoming visit that they want to talk about this issue with him. Under usual conditions, this is sort of an informal agreement between the US and Taiwan. The US has never talked on weapon sales to Taiwan with the People's Republic of China because, of course, they anticipated that the moment would come where this issue would be of enormous importance for the People's Republic of China, and then the Taiwan government sort of anticipated that its leverage in this situation was much smaller than the PRC government leverage. So they didn't want this to be an issue that Washington and Peking could talk about. But now Trump already said on the 16th of February, which was 12 days before the war in Iran started, he said openly that he is going to talk to Beijing about arms, weapons sale to Taiwan. So this is the core issue here. And I think that both governments know that they urgently need to talk to each other. For Donald Trump, the issue of rare earth materials is very, very important because they cannot build their airplanes for the army anymore, for the Air Force anymore. So this is a very, very urgent matter for him. And for China, this weapons sale issue is also a very urgent matter. So both sides have a very, very high interest in sort of achieving the common goal of having this visit take place. Nevertheless, I'm not sure whether it will really happen because, as we know, that Donald Trump is changing his policies on a daily basis. Something might happen next week that makes it impossible for China to actually welcome him in Peking. So the situation is still very uncertain, but I think it is very clear that the Taiwan issue from the Chinese government's perspective is the core issue. Everything else is sort of on second, third, fourth place of the hierarchy of issues they want to talk about.
So very interesting. Taiwan will be a center on the discussion list between President Trump and President Xi. And we know from the Chinese side, reunification has always been a longstanding policy. As we know, the famous quote, "War is a continuation of policy by other means," by Prussian military theorist Karl von Clausewitz on his seminal work on war from 1832. And it means that war is not an isolated act, but a political instrument used to achieve state goals, replacing diplomatic negotiations with violent force when policy requires. So, do you see any constellation when China will revert to war to unify Taiwan with China? Could the unstable situation in the Middle East push China to take this opportunity when the US is so involved to launch an attack to bring Taiwan under its control? And does Taiwan have real reason to be worried at the moment?
Well, I think that Taiwan has reason to worry all the time, and that at this particular moment, actually, it does not need to be as anxious about this situation as maybe a few years ago. This is because both China and the US do not want to go to war against each other at this particular moment. And for China, actually, I think the leadership is in a situation where Xi Jinping knows that his army, at least parts of his army, are not very amused about the idea of having to go to war against Taiwan. One of the reasons why he is sort of getting rid of elderly generals on a daily basis nearly and not telling us by whom he is actually replacing them. One of the reasons why this is so is because there seems to be some kind of conflict between Xi Jinping as the leader of the party and the highest commander of the army on the one hand side, and the sort of generals that have a military focus on issues on the other hand side. We see a similar thing, in the US with some of the leading personnel of the US Army actually telling President Trump that they don't think that it is a good idea to go to war against Iran. He then decided to go to war, whatever it needs. But the constellation seems to be a little bit similar in China, so that the civilian leadership, especially the leader of the country, Xi Jinping, sees a possibility and maybe even a necessity to take military means in order to unite the country. However, I think the overall consensus within the Chinese elite, as far as I can understand the situation at this moment, is that having to revert to military means is not the best solution. It's only the 1B solution, or maybe even only the 1C solution. So what they want is actually they want to convince parts of the Taiwan elites that their economic survival is guaranteed if they find a new modus vivendi with the People's Republic of China. This would mean, if they can really sort of convince them, this would mean that they would not have to go to war against Taiwan. So how do they want to convince these elites? I think this is their 1B solution, which is that they establish this kind of blockades around Taiwan. And by establishing these blockades, they actually want to exert pressure on the economic situation in Taiwan, which is highly dependent on exports and imports. And if you sort of establish these blockades, then you can see that this will, within a very short period of time, lead to enormous economic problems in Taiwan. Under these conditions, the Chinese leadership anticipates that there will be a major split among the elites, and that the so-called pragmatic members of the elites will then come up with the idea that you need a new modus vivendi with the People's Republic of China. Very interestingly, you see that Donald Trump and his Navy have established a blockade of Iran, actually using the same method that China has been sort of showing to us since 2022, when Nancy Pelosi actually visited Taiwan, and China was protesting against such a high representative of the U.S. state visiting Taiwan, because according to the PRC understanding of the agreements between the U.S. and the PRC, nobody with as a high representative of the political structures of the U.S. is allowed to visit Taiwan, because this could be identified as an indirect way of recognizing Taiwan's independence. So since the time that Nancy Pelosi actually did this, China has blockaded the island several times, and now the US Navy is blockading Iran. Interesting coincidence. So they think, with this kind of blockade, you don't need to blockade Taiwan for longer than 2 weeks. And even though a blockade is militarily speaking always a difficult thing to establish, because you can easily be hit by your enemy, on the other hand side, if you are too far away from your object, as we can see in the case of Iran, you are not really efficient, right? So it's a very tricky issue, but it's sort of like a compromise between the civilian leadership in China and the military leadership to say, we are not going for an invasion of Taiwan, because we know from our military experts that this is extremely risky and maybe not very successful. But we take military means of a different kind in order to force the elites on Taiwan into taking a tough decision, which would be, I either somewhat collaborate with the mainland, and then I can exist under a new agreement on modus vivendi or on the status quo, or I go for independence, and then I know I'm going for war, right? So this is, I think, the solution that they're actually thinking about. However, I think there are also two situations where they could overrule the kind of thinking I just introduced and actually take to military means. One situation would be for Xi Jinping to be under enormous internal pressures, under, the threat of losing his leading position inside the Communist Party of China. And if this goes along with instability within society in China, I do not exclude the possibility that he will take to military means, attack Taiwan to actually make people concentrate on the Taiwan issue rather than the domestic issue. And I think one of the reasons why the military commission of the Communist Party of China now only has 2 instead of 7 members is that Xi Jinping wants to make sure that when he will have to take this decision, he will be the only one to decide. Because the second person who is still in this commission is someone who sort of works for Xi Jinping. So he wants to make sure that his position is equal to Donald Trump's position and Vladimir Putin's position, which is in decisions on peace and war, he is the only one to decide. And in order for the political system in China to give him the right that Donald Trump has and that Mr. Putin has, that is to decide by himself whether he leads the country into war or peace, this was impossible in China so far. But now, after he has gotten rid of all the other people in this military commission, it's only him and yet another person left that will finally take this decision. And I think one of the reasons why he sort of designed this constellation is that in case his position is threatened to a point of no return, the only solution that he still has is going to war against Taiwan. But last but not least, I think there is also the possibility for China to decide to go for a military solution of the Taiwan issue because of events taking place outside China and outside the region. One such event, of course, would be if Donald Trump does what he has already explained to us. He wants to bomb Iran into Ice Age constellations. So under these conditions, I think that the People's Republic of China would not send their soldiers or their navy or their air force to Iran to help Iran. I don't think that they would dare to do this. And I don't think that this would go with their doctrine. Their doctrine is we have to really concentrate on Chinese interests. And how can they concentrate on Chinese interests and at the same time support Iran is by attacking Taiwan, right? Because if they attack Taiwan, then the U.S. is in a terrible situation. It has already taken away some of its military capacities from East Asia. So in the case of an attack against Taiwan, the U.S. will not be really, really strong. But at the same time, the U.S. must be very interested in being in that region and controlling the situation, especially as we see that Japan is now getting more aggressive in this question. And I don't think that the U.S. wants to have Japan go to war against China because of the Taiwan issue. And if they want to contain Japan, and if they want to stop Japan in maybe going to war against China, then they have to be present in the region. So if China comes to the final decision that it has to attack Taiwan in order to, at the same time, pursue its own interest and support Iran, under these circumstances, the U.S. will be in a very, very difficult situation. Of course, this will also be true in a situation where Russia is hit very badly. For example, if President Putin were killed by a drone coming from Ukraine or whatever. So if the existence of Russia as a state would be in danger, I think that under these circumstances, China will also take very radical measures, including maybe the possibility of attacking Taiwan, because if Russia falls into pieces the way the Soviet Union fell into pieces in the early 1990s, this would be a terrible threat for China because it would have U.S. presence at its really, really long northern border as a result of Russia falling into pieces. And it would have U.S. presence along its very, very long coast with the first island chain. So this would mean that it is actually more or less under pressure from all sides. And in order for this to prevent this from happening, I think they might also take radical measures like attacking Taiwan.
So Taiwan seems to be in quite the vulnerable situation now, maybe just being a pawn in greater power politics between the big players, so to speak. And let us not forget that in November 2025, Japan's Prime Minister Sanae Takaichi stated that a Chinese invasion of Taiwan could constitute a, quote, survival-threatening situation, end of quote, for Japan, allowing the country to deploy its military. This stand confirms a significant policy shift, signaling that Japan would defend Taiwan. They hope in a cooperative effort, of course, with the United States. But as you mentioned, if the United States is bogged down in Iran, the question is whether it would even come to its aid if there was a war going on, a hot war going on in Taiwan. And we have to also state now for the record that the U.S. recognizes Taiwan as a part of China, I believe. So that's the official policy. Takaichi made the remarks in Parliament, noting that a naval blockade or attack, so both of those scenarios on Taiwan, would endanger Japan's food and energy security. Under Japanese law, this crisis would enable Japan to exercise its so-called collective right of self-defense. China has expressed strong fury and warned Japan against quote, gross interference in China's internal affairs, because according to China, of course, Taiwan is part of China, so those are internal affairs. Japan continues to increase its defense capabilities, including conducting joint missile drills with the U.S., Australia, and the Philippines, according to a May 2026 report. So how likely do you see Japan coming to the aid of Taiwan if China were to attack or even just make a serious long-standing blockade of Taiwan? And will the U.S. defend Taiwan if China should attack? As you mentioned before, there are all these scenarios, which would also include Russia. So there are many moving pieces along there. And let me just, at the end state for the record, I think the 90 days where Donald Trump has to ask Congress is running out. So he really is not able to make this decision all by himself, contrary to what he thinks.
Yeah, he seems to think he can do everything he wants. And we see that in the US, there are at least some institutions still working to the effect that they try to contain his hunger for radical decisions. As a matter of fact, I think that the Japan-China issue is a comparatively hot issue. However, I do not see a Japanese elite consensus on what the Prime Minister, Sanae Takaichi, actually said in a situation where she was maybe not really prepared for the question she was asked. She was asked actually in a diet session, how would you react if anything happened to Taiwan? And then she more or less answered spontaneously. I'm not so sure that she is not professional enough to know that this hot issue cannot be answered without having it well prepared. But my impression is that the Japanese elite is very much divided over her statement, and that the only issue they're not divided on is actually the issue that they think that the position of Japan in the world should be what they call normalized. So Japan is a country that, if you look at it from international law point of view, of course, is a sovereign country. But on the other hand, it is still much more sort of contained in its sovereignty as, for example, Germany is. So the fact that in its constitution, they have this word saying that their army can only be used for defensive means and that they're not allowed to do anything that might bring war to the region. Well, all these things actually sort of limit the level of normalization this country is enjoying. And I think that Mrs. Takaichi, after she was taken maybe even a little bit aback by the kind of reactions to her argument that, if Taiwan has a contingency, then Japan also has a contingency. Well, she then sort of used this situation in order to create a consensus in Japan that their army should be a normal army, which implies that it not only has the duty to defend a country, but that can also defend other countries, right? And I think this is at least this idea that your army has to have lots of new weapons and new technologies, and that your soldiers have to be trained in a certain way so that they not only can defend the homeland, but also can defend the region against an aggressor like China, according to Mrs. Takaichi's understanding of the situation, would not leave room for Japan's interests in the region. I think that this is kind of the consensus, but the consensus in the elite in Japan is not. We have to regard China as our main enemy. We have to prepare to go to war against China because the economic entanglement between Japan and China is enormous and has been like this for much longer than the economic entanglement between China and the US and China and the EU. And so the business elite in Japan is quite nervous about the political leadership of the country sort of using a rhetoric that makes things so much more difficult with China that this will also harm the economic interests of a country whose economy has been running low for quite some time. And they're desperately looking for new ways of making the economy awake from its long malaise, right? And for that reason, I think she is actually not as aggressive, or she cannot be as aggressive as some people in China interpret her. On the other hand, I think that what she said has an impact on how China actually views the region. So far, Chinese Taiwan policies were totally focused on the US, right? They're always talking about domestic issues with Taiwan, but actually they always look at the US. What does the US allow? What do they not allow? Do they say they support Taiwan independence, or do they stick to their strategic ambiguity? So they were always watching what was going on in the US. They did not really take Japan as an actor in the region that one needs to observe, and to a certain respect, one needs to respect. Right. But after Sanae Takaichi actually came up with her Taiwan argument, I think the Chinese leadership now knows that they not only have one enemy besides Taiwan they have to deal with, but that that Japan is actually getting ready to at least support the US or defend Taiwan as long as the US is too weak in the region to support Taiwan. So Japan is sort of playing a role that is somewhat similar to the role that the EU played under the Biden administration, acting on behalf of the US so that the US would not be in a direct confrontation with Russia. So Japan could act on behalf of the US so that the US could avoid a direct confrontation between China and the US.
So Prime Minister Takaichi and a right-wing government are now actively trying to expand Japan's influence, its sphere of influence in Asia, is, as you correctly mentioned, primarily by deepening economic, technological, and security partnerships in Southeast Asia. This initiative is driven by a desire, as you stated, to counterbalance China's growing economic dominance in the region. And as you say, the Chinese are now looking more closely because of all these statements that she recently made. So it's not just mere words. So the key elements that Japan's expansion involve, some analysts are calling it the, quote, new golden age in Southeast Asia, include the updated free and open Indo-Pacific strategy, which calls for Japan to enhance security ties with nations like Vietnam, the Philippines, and Indonesia, including exporting defense equipment and holding joint exercises. Also, Japan seeks partnerships in critical areas such as semiconductors, artificial intelligence, and rare earths. It is also heavily investing in critical infrastructure to aid the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, or otherwise known as Asian Economic Development. Japan is positioning itself as a reliable partner to help ASEAN nations avoid dependence on major powers like China and also the US. So how successful can China be? How do Asian countries view Takaichi's kneeling tribute at the Australian War Memorial, which was heavily criticized by China as an act of appeasing the West? And will Japan be able to compete with China's leadership in Asia?
Well, as a matter of fact, I think we will have to discuss this question by entering through Japan rather than China, because I think that most observers in Europe have not yet realized that Japan already started assessing China as a potential rival only very shortly after China became a member of the World Trade Organization in 2001. So because Japan is so much closer to China and it has a long history of war and peace with China, it has many more experts observing the situation in China. So their companies used the opportunity of investing heavily in China in the 1980s and 1990s, when everybody else was not there yet. But then they realized with China's entry in the WTO that conditions would change rapidly. And they, under Shinzo Abe, who is actually the mentor of our female prime minister in Japan, Sanae Takaichi, he actually realized during his first term in office, which was in, if I remember correctly, 2006, 2007, he already realized that China was no longer the developing country in front of his islands, that could never threaten Japan as a leader of the region to a certain extent. But he thought that China would actually try to push out the US out of the region and take over leadership of the region. So he started thinking up all kinds of things. And for example, the idea you just mentioned of the free and open Indo-Pacific is an idea that was first voiced by Shinzo Abe when he was prime minister, and then later taken over by the US in their national security strategy of 2017. So this is the first time in US history that they actually use a wording that was not created by them and then taken over by everybody else. But this time it was actually created by Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe and then taken over by the US. So you just mentioned going to Southeast Asia. So I think Japan has always been very well connected with Southeast Asia. Of course, I mean, during the war, they were the colonizers of Southeast Asia. At the same time, they were throwing out the European colonizing forces. So it's a very ambiguous attitude of the people in Southeast Asia towards Japan. Since World War II, actually, Japan has expanded by going into Southeast Asia. And one of the reasons why Japan could develop into a very, very strong economy after World War II was because they have this very strong relationship to Southeast Asia. But for them, the Southeast Asia issue became really, really important after Xi Jinping had introduced his idea of the Belt and Road Initiative in 2013. So we are talking about a long time period where they already realized, okay, this Belt and Road Initiative is not only about overcapacities that the Chinese somewhat want to throw around the world. It is a very strategic idea. And the strategic idea we see today was very correct, that the Chinese identified two main problems in their whole economic and political setting. One is that they needed so much oil from the Near East to reach China in order for their industry to run well. And the other thing is that all the goods that they produce and they export to Europe, as well as everything they get from Europe and the Near East, has to go through two choke points. One is the Strait of Hormuz we are talking about on a daily basis nowadays. And the second one is the Strait of Malacca. So these two choke points actually are places in this maritime connectivity between China and other parts of the world that are of major importance. And by these two choke points, China can be cut off from everything it needs, right? And because of that reason, China was trying to develop alternative connections. And these alternative connections are continental connections. They go from China's far west through Central Asia, Eastern Europe to Western Europe. And they also go from China to South Asia, especially Pakistan, and avoid going through the Malacca, the Strait of Malacca. If you go through a canal or a railway track that is leading from Pakistan to the Indian Ocean. And they also built a very interesting railway system from China's far west through Central Asia, Afghanistan, and Iran. So at this moment, many goods between China and Iran, many goods are being transported not by what we think is the usual procedure, by vessels. They are actually transported by train. And the Israelis, of course, identified this problem very early on, and they bombarded this connection, at least once it had entered the Iran territory. But then, as far as I am informed, the Chinese actually sent people to repair this railway track within a very, very short period of time, which is why at this moment it is active again. So we can see that Japan and China have been in this regional rivalry for quite some time. And Japan always thought that they were more powerful in this rivalry as China, as they were not alone. They had actually had the US backing them. And so if we look at what Mrs. Takaichi said, we suddenly realize that the Japanese, or at least part of the Japanese elites, came to the conclusion that they can no longer rely on the US. And for that reason, they have to empower themselves so that they can contain or even withstand or resist China without US support. And this is, of course, an aspect that is very, very threatening to China. But it is also a sign that the US actually has lost so much the confidence of its allies that its allies actually go into a direction that none of us would have anticipated like 15 years ago.
And of course, cutting Japan off from its oil and energy, which comes from the Middle East, I think didn't help the relationship between Japan and the United States. But the key word maybe here to focus on is what you said is that now Japan is waking up, that maybe it has to stand more on its own 2 feet. As of early 2026, Japan officially maintains its, quote, 3 non-nuclear principles, which means not possessing, producing, or allowing nuclear weapons on its territory. But rising regional security threats have triggered a serious public debate about acquiring nuclear weapons or hosting nuclear arms. Prime Minister Sanae Takaichi, as of late 2025-2026, has expressed willingness to review the principles, though the government continues to officially adhere to them for now. Japan remains the only country to have suffered wartime nuclear attacks, as we all know, and we know who perpetrated them, and has strong sensitivities when it comes to this topic of nuclear weapons. While the majority of the public opposes actually possessing nuclear weapons, over 56% support debating the issue. A 2025 poll showed 46% of respondents favored keeping the non-nuclear principles, while 39% supported revising them to allow hosting U.S. nuclear weapons. So how will China react if the U.S. stations nuclear weapons on Japanese soil through nuclear sharing? Will threats from North Korea and China change public opinion in Japan in favor of nuclear weapons?
Well, as far as I understand the situation in Japan, I think the nuclear issue has always been a very hot issue, but it has not been an issue in the sense that they actually relate their own experience in dealing with nuclear issues to this political question. So the question of nuclear weapons was debated, for example, during the 1960s and the early 1970s when the agreement between the US and Japan had to be renewed. And the question was actually debated whether the US deploys its nuclear weapons only on Okinawa, and Okinawa is not a Japanese island. It's an island that the Japanese actually sort of took as part of their territory, although it was an independent kingdom centuries ago. So very interestingly, sort of this issue has been under debate and has actually ignited enormous internal turmoils and discussions for a long time. But recently, I think it is a comparatively low profile issue. And why is this so? Because it's no longer an issue of domestic concern, which it used to be. It is now suddenly a geopolitical issue. And in times in which we are living at this moment, you can easily convince an intimidated population that somehow if you have, really, really, really big and powerful weapons, then you don't need to be afraid. Although, I mean, everybody who knows a little bit about the nuclear issue knows that if you have nuclear weapons on your territory, you are on the one hand side, comparatively safe, but on the other hand side, you might also be a terrible object of attack, right? So it's a very ambiguous situation. From my point of view, China has to be very, very careful in not supporting a tendency among the Japanese population to get more and more afraid of China. And because they're more and more afraid of China, they, on the other hand, are more and more willing to accept a nuclear weapon as a form of deterrent against China. So they have to be really, really careful in handling this situation. And I'm not sure that the foreign ministry of the People's Republic of China is so very elegant in sort of handling this very, very difficult Japanese issue, as it is sometimes very elegant in handling other issues, right? For example, I think that they are handling the Iran issue quite elegantly, whereas their reaction to what happened after Sanae Takaichi had made this remark and things like this, I'm not so sure that this was a very, very good idea. Anyway, I think it is of major importance for China to find a way of not push the population of Japan into a direction that they really support the government in building up Japan's nuclear capacity. Because if these two countries both have nuclear weapons and North Korea has nuclear weapons, the situation becomes extremely dangerous. What happens if one day North Korea decides to send a nuclear weapon to Japan? What would China do in this situation? It would actually sort of a step like this on the side of North Korea would trigger immediate nuclearization of a military conflict in which, according to my understanding, China, Russia, Japan, and North Korea would be involved, right? And I think everybody can imagine that this would be a war of a size that we have so far not observed, neither with the war in Ukraine nor with the war in Iran. So I think it would be a much better solution for the region if they could decide to actually inhibit China from developing even more nuclear weapons. So far, China had a comparatively small amount of nuclear warheads. Now it is building up to 1,500. So far, we think that they have something around 450. So So this is quite something to have 1,500 rather than 450, in comparison, of course, to the approximately 4,500, I think, that the Russians have. Is that true? No, it's 4,500 that the US has and 6,500 that Russia has.
Yeah.
So
Russia has more.
this nuclear capacity, if you count Russia as part of the region of Asia, right? And you know that Pakistan has nuclear weapons, North Korea has nuclear weapons, China has nuclear weapons, and Russia has nuclear weapons. And if you add Japan, then this region will be really, really very difficult to handle.
And of course, with the war in Ukraine, Russia and China have moved closer together, which is probably going to be to the detriment of the United States and Europe. So that maybe wasn't the wisest choice if you look at the strategic aspect of the whole thing, as we just discussed. But when we stay on the topic of North Korea, of course, North Korea does have nuclear weapons and probably is happy to have it for deterrent reasons. And now North Korea has officially removed all references to unification with South Korea from its constitution, cementing a so-called two-state policy that defines the South as its most hostile state. This shift, enacted in March 2026, redefines the North as a distinct nation, abandons the goal of national unity, and reasserts its security focus on China and Russia, while maybe potentially limiting Beijing's influence. Kim Jong-un has framed the relationship not as a single nation divided, which he always framed it in the past, but as two separate hostile countries. The revised constitution formally designates Kim Jong-un as the head of state, with direct authority over nuclear forces, designating the country a, quote, responsible nuclear weapons state. The move signals a recognition that a North-led reunification is impossible, favoring instead long-term separation and strengthening its current statehood. China is expected to prioritize regional stability over reunification efforts. The U.S., of course, conducts these massive military exercises with South Korea's military each year, with a stated aim of decapitating the North Korean regime, as it says. North Korea views these exercises as an existential threat, and China, of course, would not accept a pro-Western Korea right up to China's borders. So will North Korea's new policy limit or expand China's influence? And will South Korea seek its own nuclear capabilities, in your opinion?
Well, it's very difficult to understand why North Korea changed its constitution. And I must admit that I'm not a specialist for North Korea. But when I look at the region as such from a structural realist point of view, I think I can understand what is going on in North Korea so that they took this very unexpected decision. And as a matter of fact, I'm quite influenced with my assessment of the situation by discussions in Taiwan on this issue. So analysts from Taiwan came up with the following interpretation after we had realized that North Korea had changed its constitution in a way that you just described correctly. So they think that, first of all, by this change of constitution, North Korea makes clear that any kind of conflict between North Korea and South Korea is an international conflict. It's not a domestic issue. So this would imply, for example, that in this situation, the United Nations would have a say, right? Because it's not a domestic issue, it's an international issue. Secondly, apart from changing their constitution, we also observed that North Korea destroyed all bridges and streets that so far actually linked the northern part of the country to the southern part of the country. And one would think that this is quite unusual. If North Korea actually prepared to invade South Korea, it would be a bad idea for North Korea to destroy all the streets and bridges between the northern part and the southern part. So why would they do this? And then the analysts in Taiwan say, very interestingly, they are doing this because they are not preparing to attack South Korea, but they are getting prepared for an attack from South Korea. So if you anticipate that troops are coming from south to north, you want to make it difficult for them by cutting all bridges and interrupting all streets, right? And only if you think that you want to go from north to south and you are the invader of the south, then you don't want to make things difficult for yourself. So this is why the Taiwanese came to the conclusion that in case of yet another escalation of tensions between China and the US or the US and Russia, one had to make sure that Korea is not being used by the major powers of the world the way it was used actually from the second half of the 19th century until the end of World War II. So many wars in East Asia actually took place in Korea without Korea being an active part of this war. It was actually the territory on which wars were being fought between different competitors who wanted to take over the region. At the time, it was the Tsarist Empire, the Japanese Empire, and of course, the Chinese were also involved. So I think they think in these categories. So if the tension between China, Russia, and the US is reaching a certain level of escalation, then they have to make sure that Korea will not be one of those places where they actually go to war against each other without going to war against each other. And in this situation, they anticipate that actually the fact that the US has deployed about 20,000 soldiers in South Korea itself has a very, very well-equipped and tough army, so that they would actually come to attack North Korea. And this is the reason why they have undertaken these changes. And I think that this is quite convincing analysis because it actually gives answers to things that most people who do not think in this direction simply cannot come up with and can only be very astonished about what Mr. Kim Jong-un is actually doing. On the top of that, I think that Korea as such, including South Korea and North Korea, is a strategically enormously important country, right? If you want to dominate East Asia, you need to have a say in Korea. And the reason why Korea is still split into two countries, as we just learned from North Korea, the reason why this is so, of course, is that the balance of forces in the region do not allow for one part, be it the Western part or the Chinese part, to take over the region as such. You know, this is, of course, also an outcome of China being a very, very big country. China is such a big country that you need to amass enormous forces in order to be able to actually do something against China. And for that reason, the whole region is still in a very fragile situation of balance of power. And part of this balance of power is the fact that Korea is divided into two Koreas. And when we see changes happening there, then we know that the balance of power has changed in this or that direction. And so Korea is enormously and has always been enormously important because of its geographical position in East Asia. But then Korea, that, you know, many people call a rogue country, is a country with leadership that knows that this position is very important. And it's not only important in relationship to South Korea, but as you just mentioned, it's also very important in relationship to both China and Russia, because North Korea has a border with Russia and with China. So if you take over North Korea, you can actually have an access both to China and to Russia. And in both cases, the region you get your access to is a region that is very far away from the center of the country. It's, at the end of Siberia, very far away from Moscow. And it's also far away from Beijing, right? So this implies that it is not so for Beijing and Moscow to envisage a situation where actually the US and other Western allies have a common border both with Russia and with China. And for that reason, North Korea has an extremely good position now as both Mr. Putin and Mr. Xi Jinping realized that North Korea might be a place where the Western allies could choose to hit Russia, China, Iran, and whatsoever bloc. And I think that in this situation, Russia strengthened its relationship to North Korea. And with North Korea now being a partner from Moscow in aspects that are related to the war in Ukraine, this implies that now North Korea can make lots of gains by going with Russia against China and going with China against Russia. And if you look into the history of North Korea has been was a country that was run quite well in the 1950s and 60s, where they had their relationship with both China and Russia, and they could play this game so wonderfully, aligning with China against Russia, aligning with Russia against China. They did this so well, and they developed quite well in this situation. It was only after Gorbachev had actually sort of said, no, we are no longer supporting North Korea, that North Korea actually ran into enormous difficulties. And we remember maybe that they had a major famine after, in the late 1990s and early 2000s. And only China could actually rescue the North Korean leadership from this very precarious situation. Of course, it was only China that helped the population of North Korea, at least to a certain extent, to survive. So suddenly North Korea was stuck with China and didn't have this wonderful possibility of aligning with the one against the other. And now it has this possibility. But I think that at the same time, this also implies that both Russia and China have more influence on what is going on and what is being decided in Pyongyang, which is actually also one aim. They want this so-called rogue country not to make their long-term strategic plans impossible by taking a sudden action that would shake the world, right? And so now with China and Russia being aligned with North Korea, it's good for North Korea's economy, but North Korea also has to listen more to both Russia and China than it listened to China before.
And let us not forget that there is no peace agreement after the Korean War, so there's still no official peace agreement, and we have the line of demarcation there between the North and the South. So this war theoretically could heat up anytime soon, which I don't think it will, and I hope it doesn't. I also wanted to bring in another organization which is very important for China, namely the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. China's rise is based on trade and economic development and a stable, predictable world order. In January 2026, at the World Economic Forum's annual meeting in Davos, Switzerland, Chinese Vice Premier He Lifeng stressed China's commitment to multilateralism and trade, noting in a speech that China is, quote, fostering common prosperity with its trading partners through its own development and making the pie bigger for the global economy and trade. End of quote. In the first 2 months of 2026, China's exports grew by 21.8%, reflecting a reorientation towards non-U.S. markets that has helped cushion the impact of declining trade with the United States. So what role is the SCO playing in China's plan to expand its power through trade? The last summit held in 2025 in Tianjin, China, focused on new development strategy for 2026 to 2035, and 24 agreements were signed on security, trade, and AI. So what role is the SCO playing in China's Asian leadership policy?
Well, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization is a very interesting, very tricky organization that has long been overlooked by journalists from the so-called West. There's quite a lot of research on this organization, and some people, including myself, try to understand what's going on. I think maybe we can spend yet another discussion between the two of us in trying to find out what this organization is about. Because if we want to understand what China thinks about multilateralism, I think it is very interesting to look at the Shanghai Cooperation Organization as well as at BRICS to understand how these Chinese and to a certain degree Russian idea about multilateralism is different from what scholars think multilateralism is about and what maybe some powerful countries such as the US think multilateralism is about. So let me sort of wrap up our session here with my answer to your question by coming back to your remarks at the very beginning of our conversation. You were actually referring to the fact that diplomacy, as understood in Washington and the Oval Office, is very different from what it used to be until Trump 2.0 actually came into being last year in January. So from a Chinese point of view, the fact that the US is now bullying the rest of the world, including bullying its allies, is not because Mr. Trump is a very special character and things like this. And it is actually a structural necessity. From their point of view, and to a certain degree, I can actually say that I think into a similar direction. To a certain point of view, if you look at history, if you look at empires declining in history, you will always see that the point when they start declining rapidly is the point where there can no longer be a benevolent hegemon. Right. So in this situation, they actually become extremely vulnerable because they can only try to preserve their hegemonic position in the system of international relations by coercing other countries, especially their allies, into things that these allies actually do not want to do at all. But the hegemon will always tell the allies, I'm so sorry, I have to be coercive because if you don't support me in fulfilling my interest, make America great again, if you do not support me in reaching my aims, then we will all go under. Right? So this is how they tried to convince the allies. And as you see, I mean, the Brussels leadership actually is the logic behind what they do is actually this logic. If we do not support the US in this very precarious situation, then not only US hegemony will actually die, but we as allies of the US with our political systems, with our economic networks and things like this, we will also go under together with the US. That's why we allow for the US to coerce us. We give the US what they want, or we try to give the US what they want. And only if we do this, then we can actually help the US reinventing itself as a hegemon. So a declining hegemon is characterized by a lack of benevolence in its relationship to potential partners and in its relationship to long-held allies. And I think this is exactly what we are observing in this situation. And the Chinese government is a government that has learned a form of governance which is more reactive than active. We do not understand this. We always think they have these long-term strategies. They know today what they want to do in 2050. Now, it's very interesting. This kind of one-party system that they have in China makes them very, very receptive to all kinds of things happening in a country that is so big that you could say, for someone to be able to run China properly, this guy, it's usually a man, this guy can run the world, because there are so many things happening simultaneously in China as we observe maybe in the world. So from this point of view, I think it's very interesting to see how they actually look at what is going on in the world and they react to what is going on in the world. And when they see the US declining and when they recognize that the lack of benevolence is the most clearest sign of the US declining, they go into the opposite direction. So they try to be very benevolent, and they say all kinds of very nice words and all these kind of things. They offer money to the Belt and Road Initiative, they offer support, they train your pilots, all these kind of wonderful things that actually the US used to do in the past. I mean, it's not a Chinese invention to do this, right? It's not a Chinese invention. They actually looked very closely. What did the US do in a situation where it was strong enough to be a benevolent hegemon? And they are copying exactly what the US used to do in those times, right? And I think this is very interesting. So from a Chinese point of view, the situation is very clear. The more the US is unable to avoid going down the hill, the more coercive the US will be in its relationship to long-held allies as well as to potential partners. And China can use the situation because nobody loves coercion, no individual, no country, no region loves coercion from a hegemon, okay? So China can use the situation and try to be benevolent. But in order for you to be benevolent, you need a very solid economic base. One of the reasons why the US is no longer benevolent is because the US is in a situation of overreach, right? It tries to control the whole world, but it simply doesn't have the economic base for this kind of influence. So China has to be very careful. If they actually try to be the benevolent hegemon too early without having this economic base that you need in order to be benevolent, then they will very soon fall into decline and they will very soon be in a position where they have to use coercive means too. So because of this situation, China actually is not speaking about replacing the US. China wants to share responsibility. It's not because they're so nice people. There are people like you and me, and there are some people who want to be very powerful, and there are other people who think, maybe not. So they think very much in the same categories that we do, and they say, be careful, don't take this step too early. Try to share your responsibility. It will be good for you and it will be good for your partner in sharing responsibility as well as for the rest of the world. And I think to a certain extent, we could be very happy if the world came to this kind of order, but it will not, because all these ideas about sharing have not yet included Russia, and Russia has a different mindset. So we'll talk about this in one of our next discussions. I hope I gave some kind of very theoretical answer to your question. And yeah, I just enjoy talking to you again. And I'm very much looking forward to seeing you next week.
Well, thank you, Suzanne. I think that's a wonderful note to end on. So it doesn't look like this U.S. diplomacy of destruction, or as you call it, lack of benevolence, is going to be very successful. And we see, of course, China has positioned itself as the defender of international order, of international law, all these things that the U.S. in previous times was doing. So more to be discussed, of course, in the future. I look forward to continuing our discussion. For our viewers and our listeners, thank you for tuning in to another episode of iGlobenews. Please remember to like and subscribe and to write reviews so that others can find us. We're also on Spotify and on all channels where you usually consume your podcasts. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And for our listeners, be sure to tune in next week because we are actually leading this discussion on a weekly basis. And I hope that you liked our discussion today so that you will be among our listeners also next week.
I also hope so. Thank you very much. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.